Okay, so today we're going to continue talking about female reproduction. So last time we went over the anatomy of the female. We talked about the ovary, the uterine tubes, the uterus, the vagina, and so on. And we talked a little bit about what the ovary does. And so I want to go into a little more detail about the production of the oocytes. So remember, this whole process is all about meiosis. And so just like with the male, we're going to start out with these two end cells. They're called oogonia. And so oogonia are just plain old normal body cells. And they're going to multiply by mitosis, and we're going to keep dividing and dividing until we wind up with about 500,000 of those. And so about 500,000 oogonia are going to be present in the fetal ovary. And remember, they're surrounded by little sacs, which are called follicles. So we have these primordial follicles and oogonia inside. But before the female ever reaches birth, while she's a fetus herself, these oogonia are going to start the process of becoming oocytes. And so they're going to enter meiosis 1. But what happens during meiosis 1 is they get to a certain point and they get stuck. They go into what's called suspended animation. And they get stuck right at this area here where we get tetraanimation, and it's all in prophase 1. And they don't go any further. They stay at that point. So if you look at the ovary of a young fetus, we see oogonia. But if we look at an infant or a late fetus, what we're going to see are not oogonia. We're going to see primary oocytes, all in prophase 1. And they're actually going to stay that way all the way through childhood. So birth, early childhood, all the way until puberty. And then at puberty, what's going to happen is we're going to reactivate those cells. So we're going to finish meiosis 1. And so when you finish meiosis 1, you're going to go, remember, metaphase 1, anaphase 1, telophase 1, and they're going to divide. Well, as soon as they divide, they're not called primary oocytes anymore. They're called secondary oocytes. But unlike in the male, we have what's called unequal division. Look at this. Here's this cell. And when it divides, look what happens. We get one cell which is much, much bigger and one cell which is much, much smaller. The bigger cell is called the secondary oocyte. That little tiny little bitty cell is called a polar body. And so we get a secondary oocyte and a polar body. Secondary oocyte and a polar body. Well, secondary oocyte is a functional cell. It's a big cell, actually. It's the largest cell in the human body, and it's the only one you can see with your naked eye. That's how big it is. But polar bodies are tiny, tiny, tiny little cells. In fact, they're so small they're non-functional. They have almost no cytoplasm at all, and they have no organelles. Basically, all it is the nucleus of the cell with the extra DNA in it. So one big cell and one little bitty cell. And so it kind of looks like this. So here are our oogonia. And remember, they're going to divide and divide and divide. And so we're going to have a lot of these oogonia. And again, this happens before birth. And then every single one of those oogonia is going to enter prophase 1. And right here is where they're going to get stuck. They're going to go into suspended animation, and they're all going to stay there. And nothing is going to happen until puberty. And then what's going to happen is we're going to restart some of them. And so we get a secondary oocyte and a polar body. Well, the secondary oocyte doesn't continue either. It doesn't develop any further. It stays just like that. Now, sometimes this polar body will divide. It may not happen, but sometimes it happens. And if it happens, we're going to get even two smaller polar bodies. But here's our secondary oocyte, and humans ovulate secondary oocytes. So the process is not finished when ovulation happens. It's this cell that gets ovulated right here. And nothing happens to this cell unless it's fertilized. If it is fertilized, what's going to happen? It's going to continue the process. And so it's going to go into meiosis 2. And so prophase 2, metaphase 2, anaphase 2. And then it's going to divide again. But again, it's an unequal division. And so we're going to see this big cell, which is now called an ovum, which some of us would call an egg, and a little bitty cell, which is another one of those polar bodies. And so if you look at what we get 4 cells, just like we said we were going to, but not 4 functional cells. We get 1 functional cell and 3 little bitty things, 3 polar bodies, which are not functional. So, looks something like that. Any questions about that? So, we ovulate, females do, secondary oocytes, and unless fertilization occurs, nothing else happens. But if a sperm comes along, what's going to happen is we're going to finish the process and we're going to get this ovum and another polar body. If fertilization does not happen, this doesn't go any further. It just degenerates. No further development takes place. But if a sperm does come along, so here's a little sperm, then remember we're going to finish the process and get an ovum. So if we sort of summarize that, things happen before birth. The oogonia develop. The oogonia enter meiosis 1. As soon as they enter prophase 1, they get stuck right in prophase 1. And they as soon as they enter, they're called primary oocytes. And so the female is born with about 500,000 of these primordial follicles, and inside every one of these primordial follicles is a primary oocyte. And then all through childhood, nothing else happens. So we have this whole period where the ovary is not doing anything, it's inactive. But when you do reach puberty, each month, every 28 days, some of these are going to restart the process. And so we're going to finish that. We're going to get division. Now we have a secondary oocyte. Remember, that's what's ovulated. And if a sperm comes along, then we're going to finish the process completely so that we have an ovum. But remember, we get unequal division. It's different from the male. The male, you're going to get 4 functional sperm. But in a female, you only get 1 functional cell and 3 non-functional cells. Any questions about that? Well, not only does the oocyte grow, but so does the follicle. Remember, the follicle is the little sac around it. And we start out with the primordial follicle, and it only has one layer of cells around it. Remember, these are called theca cells. And theca cells are simple squamous. That's what's going to be all the way through pregnancy, all the way through childhood. But again, at puberty, what's going to happen is not only are we going to get this restarting, but the follicle is going to begin to grow too. We're going to add these other cells, which are called granulosa cells. And so granulosa cells are different from theca cells. Granulosa cells can make hormones, and they make the hormone estrogen. So we're going to see not only the follicle growing, not only the oocyte developing, but we're also going to begin to produce estrogen. And then the follicle is going to keep growing. We're going to continue to make estrogen. Eventually, it's going to rupture. And remember, this becomes corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum can also make estrogen. But in addition to estrogen, the corpus luteum makes another hormone, progesterone. And we're going to see that in a little bit. Any questions? So hopefully you can look at this summary slide and you can follow what's going on from the fetus all the way through to puberty and beyond. Same thing over here. So something has to be controlling this. And so what controls it are hormones. And just like in the male, remember the hypothalamus is the one that's in control, and it produces a hormone called GnRH. That's what's going to start the whole thing. And then it's going to go to the pituitary, we're going to get more hormones, and it's going to go to the ovary, and we're going to get more hormones. And so when you look at it, remember we said that if you look at the ovary, it looks like this, and there's this cycle that happens in it. We start out with these primordial follicles, and then we add these granulosa cells. It becomes a primary follicle, and then little holes start to form. That's called the antrum. And as soon as those form, it's called a secondary follicle. And then we get a bunch of these little holes. They're going to merge into one big antrum, just one. And now it's this mature or Graafian follicle. And then the follicle is going to rupture, and there goes the oocyte with the granulosa cells around it. Remember, that's called the corona radiata. And then what's left of this follicle under the influence of hormones is going to turn into a corpus luteum. And remember, that lives for 14 days. And then it's going to die and become a corpus albicans. And then the process is going to start all over again. So it's a cycle. And so we can look at this cycle and we can divide it up into 3 periods. There's this period where the follicle is growing. And so that's called the follicular phase. It's when the follicle grows, and it goes from day 1 to day 14. So over here is day 1. Over here is day 14. So this whole thing from here to here is the follicular phase. And then the next phase is when we get the ovulation of the egg. The follicle is going to rupture, and that happens on or around day 14. So that's this part right here. That's the second phase. That's ovulation. And then remember, the follicle is going to turn into a corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum lives 14 days also. And so the second part of it is called the luteal phase, or third part. And so the luteal phase is the period of time when we have a corpus luteum. So one part's this, then here, and then this. 3 phases. Any questions about it? Well, again, it's hormones that are going to control this. And so we're going to look at these hormones. This is a hormone profile of a female during this 28-day period. And look, hormones go up and hormones go down. Well, we'll look at each one of them individually, but there are 4 hormones that we're going to talk about. There's FSH and LH, and there's estrogen and progesterone. These come from the pituitary. These come from the ovary. So let's look at this cycle. So again, it's called a cycle because the cycle is a circle and it happens over and over again. There you can see our 3 phases. There's the follicular phase. There's our follicle growing. And then on in 14, there's ovulation. That happens right there. And so that's the second phase. And then the follicle is going to turn into a corpus luteum. And it's going to last another 14 days. And so that's the luteal phase. Well, these cells make hormones. So these granulosa cells make estrogen. So as soon as we start getting granulosa cells, we're going to get estrogen. But this over here has been changed. It's not a follicle anymore, it's a corpus luteum. And these cells make both estrogen and progesterone. And so if we were to graph what that would look like, it would look like this. So look, here is when the cells are growing. That's our proliferative phase. And look, estrogen goes up. But right here's day 14. And remember, it's going to become a corpus luteum after that. And it makes both estrogen and progesterone. And so they're both going to go up. So this is kind of what happens in the follicular phase. So our primordial follicle is going to become a primary follicle. It's going to add these granulosa cells. Granulosa cells are going to make estrogen. We're also going to form a layer around the oocyte, which is going to protect it. That's called the zona pellucida. And we're going to form that space, the antrum, with full of fluid. And so there's our primordial follicles. Here you can see the primary ones. There's our granulosa cells. There's our granulosa cells. And again, they're going to begin to make estrogen. And so estrogen is going to begin to go up. And that's exactly what's happening here. So there's our granulosa cells. And they're going to make estrogen. Estrogen is going to go up. But remember, on day 14, something else is going to happen. We're going to get ovulation. Well, that is caused by other hormones. It's caused by LH and FSH. Those hormones are going to cause ovulation to happen. And that's why it happens on around day 14. Remember, some females can feel it when it happens. It's called Mittelschmerz. But that's this. Well, not only does the follicle rupture, but the follicle is going to turn into this corpus luteum. And so when a corpus luteum is formed, we're going to get both estrogen and progesterone. So if we look at what that would look like, it looks like this. So here's estrogen, this light blue line. So we're in the follicle. So look, estrogen goes up. There is no progesterone. Progesterone is basically 0. But here we're going to get ovulation, and we're going to turn into this corpus luteum. And so estrogen is going to go back up, and so is now progesterone. So you can see that exact same thing here. So estrogen goes up while we have the follicle growing. And right here's ovulation. The follicle's going to rupture, and we get this little dip when it ruptures. But it also turns into a corpus luteum. And corpus luteum makes estrogen, but it also now makes progesterone. And then remember, the follicle looks like this. Corpus luteum looks like this, but it dies. It turns into a corpus albicans, and the corpus albicans makes no hormones. So we were making estrogen, we were making progesterone, but right here is where it dies, and these are going to fall off. So if you look at it here, right here we're making estrogen. Right there we're going to get that little dip because of ovulation, but it goes back up. Corpus luteum makes estrogen and progesterone, but right here is where it dies. And when it dies, estrogen is going to fall off and progesterone is going to fall off. And then the corpus luteum, remember, turns into this corpus albicans. So that's kind of what this ovarian cycle is. So let's go back and look at it in a little more detail. So first of all, there's our primordial follicles. And what's going to happen is the hypothalamus is going to release GnRH. GnRH is going to go to the pituitary, and we're going to get the release of FSH and LH. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and that's what it's going to do, stimulate these follicles and make them grow. So the follicles are going to grow. LH, which stands for luteinizing hormone, causes the follicle to make estrogen. So LH is also going to go to the follicle, and we're going to get estrogen. So if we look at our graph, it looks like this. So look, there's FSH, it goes up, LH goes up, the follicle's going to grow, estrogen is going to go up. But that's going to keep happening until we reach here. And on day 14, what's going to happen is we're going to get a spike of GnRH. When we get a spike of GnRH, we're going to get a spike of FSH and LH. And that spike is what's going to cause this ovulation to happen. And we can see that here. Wrong direction. We can see that here. So look, here's day 14 right there. It's where we get this spike of FSH and LH. And that spike is what's going to cause ovulation. Well, ovulation causes the follicle to rupture. And so the rupture makes the estrogen dip. It dips because it's ruptured and it's interfered with. But not only does FSH and LH cause this ovulation, LH, remember, stands for luteinizing hormone. And what that luteinizing hormone does is it turns the follicle into a corpus luteum. So that spike, not only is it going to cause this to happen, but it's also going to cause this to happen. Remember, a corpus luteum makes two hormones. It makes estrogen, and it also makes progesterone. So now when we look at it, look, estrogen is going to go back up, But now we've had no progesterone at all until now when we have this corpus luteum, and now it's going to go up as well. But this thing is only going to live for 14 days. And at the end of 14 days, it's going to die. And when it dies, it can't make any hormones. So look what happens when it dies. Estrogen falls off and progesterone falls off because the corpus luteum has died. And then it's going to start all over again, because what's going to happen is GnRH is going to be released again. FSH is going to be released again. LH is going to be released again. And the whole process is just going to start over. So again, right here, GnRH, which is going to cause the release of FSH and LH. FSH is going to cause the follicles to grow. LH is going to cause the follicles to make estrogen. And then we're going to get this spike. We're going to get a spike in GnRH, a big jump, which is going to give us a spike in FSH and a spike in LH. And when that happens, we're going to get ovulation. But not only that, that LH is going to cause that to become a corpus luteum. And so now we're going to get both estrogen and progesterone. But remember, it's only going to live 14 days. And then it's going to die. And when it dies, estrogen is going to go down. And progesterone is going to go down. And then this is going to start all over again. So if we look at this follicle, there it is. Remember, we got GnRH. And look, we got FSH. FSH causes the follicle to grow, but we also have LH. LH causes the follicle to make estrogen. Right here is when we get this surge. That's going to cause ovulation. But that surge of LH is also going to cause this to happen. And then remember, it lives 14 days, and then it's going to die. And we're going to start all over again. Does it make sense? So here's kind of the thing. So here's GnRH. Comes from the hypothalamus. Causes the release of FSH and LH. So FSH is going to cause the follicle to grow. LH is going to cause the follicle to release estrogen. So estrogen is going to go up. And you can see estrogen going up right here. And then at some point on about day 14, when estrogen levels get to a certain level, we're going to get this surge, spike of GnRH, of FSH, and LH. And so we can see that happen right here. Right here. And that surge is going to cause ovulation to happen. So we're going to get ovulation. But not only are we going to get ovulation, remember LH is going to turn this thing into a corpus luteum. But right there's ovulation. Right here's where ovulation is going to happen. Look, the rupture of the follicle interferes with estrogen, so temporarily it goes down. But remember, this LH is going to cause it to become a corpus luteum. So LH is going to transform the follicle into a corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is going to make both estrogen and progesterone. So estrogen is going to go back up and progesterone is going to go back up or go up. Estrogen go back up, progesterone go up. And then finally, remember this corpus luteum is going to convert to a corpus albicans and it's going to die. And so those hormones are going to go down. And then the cycle is going to start all over again. And so if we look at this cycle, it looks like this. So in RH, there it is, goes the anterior pituitary, FSH and LH. We're going to get the follicle growing. We're going to make estrogen. And then we're going to get this surge, and that's going to cause ovulation. It also causes this to become a corpus luteum, and we're going to get more estrogen and now progesterone until the thing dies, and it's going to start all over again. It's a cycle. Any questions? Trying to find the one picture, but I can't find it. So it's a cycle over and over and over again. The cycle on the average lasts about 28 days. Again, you can split it up into 3 phases. So the first phase is when the follicle is growing, so it's called the follicular phase. And then on day 14 or thereabout is ovulation, so that's the second phase. And then the last part, that follicle is going to become a corpus luteum, so it's called the luteal phase. So in the follicular phase, we have just estrogen. In the luteal phase, we have estrogen and progesterone. And then again, remember, these are controlled by FSH and LH. Any questions? So that's the ovarian cycle. And it just happens over and over and over again. And so the whole point of this ovarian cycle is to get this oocyte out and get it to a place where it can be fertilized. But remember, that's not enough. We also have to provide a place for it to develop. And so alongside this ovarian cycle, we're going to have a cycle happening in the uterus too. So the uterus is there has to be prepared for the fertilized egg. And if it's not prepared, if it arrives at the wrong time, the fertilized egg will not be hung on to. And so we have the same 28-day cycle. So if we look at this uterine cycle, it has to match up with the ovarian cycle. Well, remember the hormones that control the ovarian cycle were GnRH, LH, and FSH. And remember, we're going to make hormones. Here's a hormone that's made, and it's estrogen. That's what the follicle makes. And estrogen causes this to happen. And then the corpus luteum, remember, makes estrogen and progesterone. And that is what makes this happen. And then remember, this does not make estrogen or progesterone, neither one. And that is what makes this happen. So they're all connected to each other in this cycle. So let's look at the uterine cycle. So again, the uterus needs to prepare itself for this fertilized egg. And so it goes through this series of changes that happen. It happens with the endometrium. Remember we talked about the endometrium? We said that there were 2 layers to it. There was a stratum basalis, but there was also a stratum functionalis. And that stratum functionalis goes through this cycle based on these hormones. When there's no estrogen and no progesterone, it sheds off. So we get menstruation. But then the follicle grows and estrogen is there by itself. And when we get estrogen alone, we get what's called proliferation. It rebuilds itself. And then when we have estrogen and progesterone, not only is it rebuilding itself, it becomes secretory. It secretes all kinds of nutrients in preparation for this oocyte or this developing embryo. And so again, you can see it here. So here's menses. So that's the first stage. Here it's growing. That's the proliferative stage. And here, not only is it growing, but these glands are secreting like crazy. That's the secretory phase. And then it's going to slough off. And we're going to get menses again. And then it's going to grow. And then it's going to become secretory. And then it's going to slough off. Just like what we talked about with the ovary, it's this 28-day cycle. So we're going to get menses, we're going to get growth, we're going to get secretion, and then menses, growth, and secretion. And again, it's controlled by the hormones. And so if we look at this endometrium, look at the thickness of the endometrium right here. That's the stratum functionalis. That's it. This is the part that changes. This part down here doesn't change. But now, that's during menses. But now if you look at it in proliferation, look what's happened. It's grown like crazy. It's this much of it now. And look at these glands that are growing in here. Tons of little glands so that we can provide nutrients. And then this one, it's down here somewhere. It's not even on the picture how big it is. And look at the glands in here now. Huge glands that are growing and secreting like crazy. And then that's going to happen. It's going to slough off again. And then we go to this again and go to this again. And then it's going to slough off again. Again, it's a cycle. So if we look at it here, these first few days are where menses happen. And then here we're going to increase the thickness in preparation for the embryo that's going to come along. Right here's where ovulation happens. Remember, it only lives for 24 hours. And so we have to have fertilization between here and here. And then remember, it takes 6 to 8 days to get to the uterus. So if we add another 6 to 8 days, here we are right here. This is where the embryo enters the uterus. And so right here is where it should be the most hospitable, the most prepared. And then here we get implantation and development. And if it doesn't happen, it's going to slough off again. Again, it's controlled by these hormones. So estrogen causes proliferation. Estrogen and progesterone causes secretion. And then when you don't have either one, you get menses. Any questions? So this ovarian cycle controls the uterine cycle. And remember, the hypothalamus and pituitary are going to control the ovarian cycle. And so they're all connected to each other. So if we put them all on one graph, this is a very nice summary slide. Look what it is. Here's GnRH. Here's FSH and LH. So GnRH from the hypothalamus, as it goes up, FSH release goes up, and LH goes up. And look, here's where it peaks, and there's where that peaks. Well, remember when we have FSH, the follicle is going to grow. And LH is going to cause the follicle to make estrogen. So estrogen is going to go up. And then on or around day 14, we're going to get this peak, and that's going to cause ovulation. It also ruptured the follicle, so estrogen is going to drop off it for a little while. But not only is it going to cause ovulation, LH is going to cause it to become a corpus luteum, which makes estrogen and now progesterone, which we haven't had any progesterone at all. So now we have both progesterone and estrogen. And so the follicle, the uterus is going to become secretory. So over here, no estrogen, no progesterone. So we get menses. Here, we just have estrogen. Here, we have estrogen and progesterone. Make sense? Any questions? Another thing that happens right here at ovulation is the female's body temperature changes. Look, you can see a jump in body temperature right here. Now, it's not a very big jump. Look, it only goes from 34 or 36.4 to 36.7 Celsius. So it's not a big change, but if you monitor your body temperature every single day, at the same time of the day, before you eat, before you exercise at all, before you do anything like that, you can chart your temperature. And if you chart your temperature, when you see this jump, you know that this has happened. And some people who are trying to get pregnant or trying to avoid pregnancy chart their temperature so that they know when ovulation happened. Now, we say it happens on day 14, and we say that this is 28 days. But remember, those are averages. Some people have a 25-day cycle. Some people have a 35-day cycle. Some people ovulate on day 14. Some people ovulate day 18. So these are averages. But like I said, if you chart your temperature every single day, you can see when that happens. And if you're trying to get pregnant, this is the time when the best time for copulation, because remember, it only lives about 24 hours. So there's only a window here, from here to here, that fertilization can happen, this very small window. Now, sperm can actually live in the female reproductive tract for about 72 hours. And so copulation could have occurred over here as well. So copulation can occur up to 3 days before to 1 day after. So there's about 4 days per month that pregnancy or that conception can happen, and that's it. These 4 days per month. But you have to know which days they are. Any questions about all this? Can everybody kind of put all this together on this graph? So what happens with the hypothalamus? What happens with the pituitary? What happens in the ovary? And what happens in the uterus? Can everybody see how that works? And again, it's this cycle, this circle, and everything has to be timed. And so these 4 hormones are the hormones that are most important. Here's another summary slide, same sort of thing. Doesn't have GnRH on it, but has everything else on it. But there's that one. Any questions? So here's another summary slide, but look, it's a different format. This is a diagram, but basically it's the exact same thing. So look, there's our hypothalamus, and here's GnRH. So the hypothalamus releases GnRH, it goes to the anterior pituitary. Remember, we're going to get 2 hormones, FSH and LH. So both those hormones are released. FSH is going to go to the ovary, and it's going to cause the follicle to grow. LH is going to go to the follicle, but it's going to cause the follicle to release estrogen. And then remember what's going to happen on around day 14. We're going to get a spike of this, a spike of this, a spike of this. We're going to get ovulation. But remember, this also is going to cause that follicle to become a corpus luteum. So now we're going to have both estrogen and progesterone. And remember, that's going to cause the uterus to become not only big, but secretory. And then when you don't have this, and you don't have this, and you don't have this, everything sloughs off. But just like in the male, remember we talked about how testosterone, not only does it have anything to do with reproduction, but it also has to do with what are called secondary sex characteristics. Well, we have the exact same thing here, except it's estrogen and progesterone that have to do with these secondary sex characteristics. So both of these hormones go out into the blood, and they go everywhere. And they have all kinds of effects. So they cause the skeleton to change. So if you think about what happens to the skeleton of the female at puberty, they cause muscle development. We're going to get things like glands growing, breasts growing, all the things that when you think of a female, those things. Differences in skin, differences in voice, all sorts of things. All of those secondary sex characteristics are going to happen. And so we're going to get these what are called extrauterine effects. And so we're going to get anabolic effects on all of these organs, as well as the development of these secondary sex characteristics. And here are these secondary sex characteristics. The breasts grow, we get fat deposition in the hips, also the breasts, the changing in the skeleton and the muscles, and also things like development of axillary and pubic hair. And then remember, estrogen is not what causes the female sex drive, it's testosterone. So testosterone, not only does it cause the male sex drive, but it causes the female sex drive as well. Well, the ovary does not make testosterone, so that testosterone has to come from the adrenal cortex. So hopefully you remember the adrenal cortex. It has those 3 zones. This is the zona, reticularis. So that's what causes the female sex drive, this testosterone. Any questions? So you should definitely go back to something that looks like this and make sure you understand all these events that are happening. Any questions? So that's about where we're going to stop today. So next time, which will be Monday, we will completely finish and we will be done basically with the whole course. And then you can have Tuesday, of course, and Wednesday to finish up the case studies if you haven't already done those. But remember, everything is due by midnight on Wednesday the 13th. I had a couple of students who asked me or thought that they were due this past Wednesday, and they were panicking like crazy because they hadn't turned in everything. But don't panic. It's due on the 13th by midnight. Any questions? Well, thank you so much for being here, and I hope that you have a nice weekend, and if you come back, I'll see you on Monday. By Monday, I should have everything that at least I have right now graded, and the grades should be in the grade book. So you should be able to look and see what your grades are, and see that'll give you a couple of days if you need to do anything else. Any questions?